The birth of Arthur of Brittany was already an act of rebellion. His paternal grandfather had expected him to be named in his honor, but his mother, Constance, had other plans. She chose instead to name him after the legendary King Arthur, a figure the Bretons believed to be one of their own. From the very start, Arthur's life was set on a path of conflict, often clashing with his powerful Plantagenet relatives. This tension ultimately led to his disappearance in April 1203, an event that likely ended in his violent murder. Welcome back to Lemmy history. As you might know, we like to talk about missing Plantagenet princes here on this channel, just once in a while, occasionally you might say. But the first missing Plantagenet prince hasn't had the spotlight yet. Let's change that. Arthur's story carries strikingly familiar elements. He became a contender for the English throne after the unexpected early death of a king. His chief rival, his own uncle, the very man whom history widely assumes to be responsible for his demise. However, was this just a case of enemy propaganda? Many of the surviving sources were written by authors with a vested interest in portraying the uncle as a villain. The key accusation against him came from a former favorite, an insider turned witness against his former patron. Adding to the intrigue, Arthur's mother, Constance, was politically ambitious and had no intention of bending to England's expectations. Even if her son's fate was sealed at a young age, she had a daughter who would one day rule. The parallels with the infamous princess in the tower are undeniable, yet there were also significant differences. The setting, for one, was entirely in France, and while John, like Richard III, was the youngest brother, he lacked Richard's intelligence and military prowess. Meanwhile, Arthur was no longer a child. According to chronicler Matthew Paris, Pope Innocent III initially refused to support him, declaring he was anything but innocent. Later, the Pope would come to regret this stance, but we'll get to that at the end of the video. Arthur never met his father. He was born on March 29, 1187, in Nantes, 7 months after Duke Geoffrey of Brittany had been trampled to death by a horse at a tournament in Paris. At birth, Arthur was not considered a serious contender for the English throne. His grandfather, Henry II, who had insisted the child be named after him, was still alive, and two of his sons, Richard and John, were also still breathing. However, Arthur's birth disrupted the carefully laid plans of Henry, the architect of the Angevin Empire. Brittany did not belong to Henry, but to Arthur's mother, Constance. He had once resolved this issue by forcing her to marry his son, Geoffrey. In fact, he had deliberately delayed the wedding for as long as possible to maintain control over Brittany in the name of his future daughter-in-law. With Arthur's birth, Constance could now rule Brittany in her own right as regent for her son. Henry attempted to counter this by marrying her off to his loyal follower, Ranulph of Chester, in 1188 or 1189. Ranulph had only just reached adulthood and was nearly a decade younger than his bride. The marriage, however, existed only on paper. Ranulph was rarely in Brittany and almost never used the title of Duke of Brittany. Only a single surviving document bears his signature in that capacity. It was a letter to the Bishop of London, a figure of no relevance to Brittany. Still, this was not the last time Ranulph would enter the story. Arthur grew up without a father figure to guide him. His mother tried to fill that role, but as a woman she faced significant limitations. One such example followed shortly after Henry's death in 1189. His eldest surviving son, Richard, succeeded him and almost immediately set off on the crusade. While in Sicily, Richard not only arranged Arthur's betrothal, but also named him as his heir in the event he did not return, and had no children of his own. All of this was done without consulting Constance, but that was not the only decision Richard made without her input. He also arranged for Arthur's older sister Eleanor to marry Duke Leopold of Austria. In 1194, Eleanor was already on her way to her new husband when word arrived that he had died, allowing her to turn back. Later, Richard and the French king Philip Augustus discussed marrying Eleanor to Philip's son Louis, but that too never came to pass. During this time, Constance focused on blocking every attempt by the Plantagenets to seize Arthur's guardianship. Both Henry and Richard had tried. For a while, the crusade and Richard's imprisonment in Germany gave Constance and Arthur some respite. However, upon Richard's return, the situation escalated. He traveled to France, securing Angevin territories through a mix of military force and personal charisma. He also settled old scores with Philip Augustus. When the two kings agreed to a truce in 1196, Richard summoned Constance to his court in France. Constance immediately suspected that Richard intended to take control of Arthur. After all, he already had Eleanor in his custody. To thwart him, she left her son in the care of her duchy's leading nobles, who swore to protect him. Then disaster struck. Ranulph, likely acting on Richard's orders, kidnapped Constance. The scheme was clear. If they controlled both mother and son, they could take over Brittany. But Constance's foresight had already unraveled this plan. Richard demanded that the Breton barons hand over Arthur, but they remained loyal to their oath and refused. They even hid the young prince in a church. Unwilling to be defied, Richard responded with brutal force, marching into Brittany and even setting fire to a church on Good Friday. What happened next is difficult to reconstruct with certainty. It seems Richard reached a tentative agreement with the barons. He would release Constance if she complied with his directives in governing the duchy. In exchange, he would take custody of Arthur and remove him from Brittany. However, Constance may have preferred captivity over surrendering her son. Whatever the case, by August 1196 she had not been released as planned. Instead, Richard returned with an even stronger show of force. But this time he had overplayed his hand. The Breton barons mounted fierce resistance. They met Arthur 30 miles from Rennes, swore their fealty to him and made the 9-year-old promise that he would not make peace with the English king without their consent. Determined to protect him, they then smuggled him to the French royal court. Philip II welcomed Arthur and ensured he was educated alongside his own son Louis. The two boys, close in age, quickly became friends. In Paris, Arthur learned the art of war in the company of the king and some of the highest nobles of the empire, connections that would shape him for life. Richard had been outmaneuvered. Though no one called it a capitulation, that was effectively what followed. In 1197, the English king released Constance and pardoned the Breton barons. Once again, Arthur's mother ruled her duchy in her own name. Arthur remained in Paris for most of the next 2 years, occasionally traveling to Brittany to be introduced to the affairs of government, preparing for the role he was destined to inherit. During this time, an unexpected rapprochement took place between Arthur and a member of the English royal family who had his own troubles with Richard, his younger brother John. John had repeatedly betrayed the English king only to be forgiven each time, but their relationship remained deeply fractured. Operating on the principle that the enemy of his enemy was his friend, John sought an alliance with Constance and Arthur. Then, in the spring of 1199, a remarkable situation unfolded. Arthur, now 12 years old, was tasked with hosting his paternal uncle for the first time. Chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall reports that John had recently stormed out of Richard's court in Normandy after yet another quarrel with his brother. United in their disdain for the man on the English throne, uncle and nephew found common ground. But everything changed in an instant. A message arrived like a thunderclap. Richard had died from a crossbow wound. The Angevin Empire was suddenly left without a ruler. Constance reacted with lightning speed, immediately claiming Anjou, Touraine and Maine for her son. Until September 1199, Arthur focused on consolidating control over these regions with the full support of the French king. Meanwhile, his mother ensured that Brittany's most powerful barons stood firmly behind him. A charter issued by Arthur on Easter Day 1199 bore several well-known names, among them William de Roches, who had previously been aligned with John. Now Des Roches took charge of Arthur's campaign, coordinating operations and serving as both seneschal and commander-in-chief of the prince's army. To this day, historians debate whether Constance and Arthur had already laid claim to the English throne. Decades later, the biographer of William Marshall recounted a conversation that the influential baron allegedly had with Hubert, the Archbishop of Canterbury, after they received news of Richard's death. The dialogue is almost certainly fictional, yet it offers insight into the political landscape. The Archbishop supposedly argued that Arthur had the legal right to succeed Richard. Marshall, however, favored John, pointing out that Arthur had dangerous advisors, an allusion to Philip II of France. Hubert conceded, if Marshall wanted John on the throne, then John would be king. This exchange illustrates how English royalty depended on the consensus of the barons, a reality John himself would later be reminded of by force. In France, rumors circulated that Richard had named John as his successor on his deathbed, likely spread by John's own supporters. Seizing the initiative, John took Chinon Castle and secured the Angevin treasury on the continent before heading for Normandy. At this moment, his fate nearly took a drastic turn. Arthur had sworn feudal allegiance to Philip II at Le Mans for Anjou, Maine, Touraine and Brittany. Together with his mother, he led an army with a single objective: capturing John. According to some accounts, they missed him by mere minutes, despite the fact that John had originally intended to remain in Le Mans longer. However, all participants should now receive a masterclass in the late medieval exercise of power by no king and no baron, and not by Arthur's ambitious and talented mother either, instead a player who had worked in the shadows until now entered the stage. John's mother, Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine. Eleanor had anticipated the plans of Arthur, Philip and Constance well in advance. She sent her son a message that could not have been clearer: run! John took her advice and in May 1199 secured his coronation as King of England. Eleanor then played another decisive role, tirelessly insisting that Richard had indeed chosen John as his successor. She had been at Richard's side when he died. Who would dare question her word? Turning her attention to Desroches, Eleanor skillfully exploited his resentment toward Philip II, who had destroyed Boulogne Castle in Maine, where Desroches held authority as seneschal. When he confronted the French king, Philip arrogantly declared that the monarch was the supreme authority in all of France. Seizing the moment, Eleanor questioned whether Desroches truly believed the French king should wield such influence. The baron took the bait. He let Eleanor know that he might be willing to switch back to John's side on the condition that he had a say in Arthur's fate, and retained his position. John and Eleanor had no objections. By September 1199, Eleanor had won. With Normandy secure and an English army at his command, John marched against Arthur and Constance. Facing overwhelming force, they chose to submit at Le Mans on September 22nd. For Constance, however, an unpleasant surprise awaited. After Richard's death, she had secured an annulment from Ranulph. Now she was forced into a new marriage, to Guy de Thouars. Some historians have speculated that this may have been a love match due to the lack of political significance. Nothing could be further from the truth. Guy was a loyal follower of John. With Constance subdued, Philip II had little reason to continue the fight. Instead, negotiations between the two kings began at the end of 1199. Once again, Eleanor worked behind the scenes, ensuring Arthur and his mother were excluded from the talks. Philip proposed allowing Arthur to retain Anjou, Touraine and Maine, but John flatly refused. In May 1200, the Treaty of Le Goulet was signed, a resounding victory for John. Arthur retained only Brittany, the one territory he had inherited through his mother. Everything else fell to John, whom Philip formally recognized as Richard's successor. To make matters worse, Arthur was forced to receive Brittany from John as a vassal, swearing fealty to him. Philip managed to extract some concessions. John had to swear loyalty to the French crown for his continental possessions, abandon several allies, and pay over £13,000 to the French king. All homages happened at the royal court in Paris, a setting where Arthur and his mother had been rendered powerless. Broken, Constance withdrew to Brittany, where she died the following year. Eleanor, believing her work complete, prepared for retirement. She had appointed John as her successor in Aquitaine and entered a monastery, expecting to live out her remaining years in peace. She was wrong. What John's mother didn't realize was that her son had the strategic mind of a stone. Arthur became Duke of Brittany in 1201, ruling in his own name despite being a minor. The Breton barons had likely consented to this arrangement. Meanwhile, John summoned Arthur to his court in 1202, instructing him to pay homage as agreed in the treaty with Philip II. His letter was addressed to our beloved nephew. However, Arthur refused. By then, the treaty had effectively become obsolete. John, for his part, had recently complicated matters further. He had dissolved his first marriage to Isabella of Gloucester due to her failure to produce an heir. On August the 24th, 1200, he married Isabel, daughter of Count Adhemar of Angoulême. The problem? Isabel had already been promised to the Lusignans, one of the most powerful families in Poitou. Chroniclers at the time speculated that John must have been bewitched to make such a reckless decision. Later, rumors would circulate that John spent more time in bed with his young wife than on the battlefield, allowing Philip to overrun Plantagenet territories. But the scandal of the marriage didn't stop there. Isabel was only 12 years old and her father, Adhemar, was a vassal of the French crown. Richard himself had needed military force to keep him in line. It was at Adhemar's castle that Richard had been fatally wounded by a crossbow. The Lusignans, enraged by the betrayal, turned to Philip II, John's liege lord, to protest. Meanwhile, John assembled an army in England and arrived in Normandy in June 1201. Seizing the opportunity, Philip summoned all parties to Paris in an apparent attempt at mediation. Officially, John was to hear the Lusignans' grievances as their overlord in Aquitaine. But when the Lusignans finally received the summons, it was more of a demand. John had turned the tables, accusing them of high treason. Instead of resolving the dispute, he insisted they settle the matter through trial by combat, not against him directly, but against hand-picked champions. We can only guess how much Philip and Eleanor must have rolled their eyes when they heard about it. The Lusignans, expecting justice and respect, refused to travel to John. Instead, they once again appealed to Philip. The French king attempted to pressure John into granting them a proper trial. John officially agreed, but slyly refused to guarantee the Lusignans safe passage through his lands. At last, Philip had enough. He summoned John to Paris to explain his actions. When John failed to appear, Philip declared him a disobedient vassal and confiscated Anjou, Poitou and Aquitaine for the French crown. Including Aquitaine in the confiscation, however, meant bringing Eleanor back into the game. Philip should have known better. At first, the situation seemed manageable. Arthur traveled to Paris, where he was betrothed to Philip's 6-year-old daughter, Marie. He was granted all of John's confiscated lands and was knighted by the French king. Philip then placed 200 knights under his command. With his new army, Arthur marched with the Lusignans and his Breton forces into Anjou, while Philip prepared to attack Normandy. Eleanor, now over 75 and in poor health, attempted to resolve the crisis diplomatically. She journeyed to Castile to arrange a marriage between one of her granddaughters and Philip's son, Louis. However, her mission was cut short. Arthur's troops surrounded her in the city of Mirabeau. She withdrew to the castle and took personal command of the small garrison. Arthur had a golden opportunity. A decisive victory would allow him to crush John's army with Philip's help in a coordinated assault. Confident of success, Arthur and the Lusignans assumed the castle would surrender quickly. They had taken the city within hours. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Eleanor was playing for time. The moment she realized she was trapped in Mirabeau, she sent a desperate message to John. Come immediately. The implication was clear. John had to act immediately. If he failed, Philip would gain free reign in Normandy, and Arthur's claim to the English throne would gain dangerous momentum. Still, Eleanor wasn't just waiting for rescue. With her characteristic charm and authority, she convinced her few defenders to fight on, despite Arthur's assurances that they could withdraw peacefully if they surrendered. She even met with her grandson under the guise of negotiating a peaceful resolution, all the while stalling for time. John for once followed orders. His mother had made it clear he had to move fast. Within an astonishing 48 hours, he led his army on an 80-mile forced march to Mirabeau. De Roche, familiar with the terrain, guided them directly into the city. Arthur's army was caught completely off guard, according to contemporary chronicles. The Lusignians were reportedly in the middle of breakfast enjoying roast pigeon when John's forces struck from behind. The battle was swift and decisive. Arthur's troops were trapped between the castle walls and John's advancing army. The prince himself was allegedly captured before he even had a chance to enter the fight. John's victory was absolute. Along with Arthur, he seized the young prince's sister, who would never regain her freedom for the rest of her life. The Lusignians also fell into his hands. Philip II, seeing the crushing defeat, did not even attempt a military intervention. He was now hopelessly outmatched. With the crisis resolved in John's favor, Eleanor once again withdrew to her convent, where she would pass away in 1204, but it quickly became evident that without her guidance her son was dangerously inept. Let us recall, William de Roche had switched allegiances in exchange for John's promise that he would have a say in Arthur's fate. Ironically, John's victory had only been possible due to de Roche's support. Yet, in a move characteristic of his political short-sightedness, the English king broke his word. Ignoring de Roche completely, he alienated one of his most crucial allies. Furious, de Roches defected to the French king. Philip wasted no time in making his position clear. There would be no peace until Arthur was safely released. That moment would never come. After his capture, Arthur was imprisoned in the Tower of Falaise. According to rumors circulating in France, the conditions were appalling. John, allegedly persuaded by his advisors, considered a brutal solution. If Arthur were blinded and castrated, he would no longer be seen as a viable ruler. To carry out this order, John sent 2 men to the fortress, but Hubert de Burgh, the castle's commander and Arthur's chief jailer, flatly refused. It could not be done. Instead, he spread false news that Arthur had died, hoping this would break the Bretons' resolve. The plan backfired. Outraged by the supposed murder, they immediately rose in rebellion. De Burgh, realizing the mistake, hastily retracted the statement, insisting that Arthur was still alive. Roger of Wendover claims that in late January 1203, John traveled personally to Falaise and confronted his nephew. The king reportedly promised Arthur great rewards if he would submit and swear homage. Arthur, however, is said to have not only refused but to have furiously insisted that he was Richard's rightful heir. Whether this conversation truly took place is uncertain. What is known for sure is that John was in Falaise at the time. John then had Arthur transferred to Rouen, where his imprisonment became even harsher. Meanwhile, the king's military situation deteriorated further. With each defeat at the hands of Philip II, Arthur's fate grew more precarious. Then, in April 1203, something happened, though exactly what remains a mystery. Only 2 accounts seem even remotely credible. One version, attributed to William the Breton, whose name alone suggests a need for skepticism, claims that John took Arthur out onto the Seine in a boat, stabbed him to death, and threw his body overboard. Later fishermen supposedly found the corpse. The second version, long overlooked, comes from a Welsh monastery. At first it seemed unlikely that monks in Wales would have access to such information. However, it turned out they had received details from William de Brioze, a powerful noble, and then one of John's closest confidants. I made a video about what happened to his family. It was not a happy story. According to this account, on the night of April 3rd, 1203, John, in a drunken frenzy, became possessed by the devil. Overcome with rage, he ordered Arthur's cell opened, entered and strangled his nephew with his bare hands. As in the first version, the body was dumped into the Seine, but this time it was never recovered. Philip II refused to accept Arthur's death as fact until 1204. Without question, Arthur posed a serious threat to the reign of the 3rd Plantagenet king, but his murder only exposed John's lack of political sense. The Bretons immediately defected to the French crown, while powerful allies, such as William de Roches, saw John as a liar and abandoned him. Within a few years, the Angevin Empire crumbled. This downfall was not solely due to John's failures in France. He treated his English barons no better than the French nobility. Rule in those days depended on the consensus of the governed. That consensus could sometimes be achieved through force, but it could not be ignored altogether. John is often at the top of the list when discussing the worst kings in English history. While opinions on what makes a good or bad ruler may vary, few would argue that he was an effective one. William Marshal was in Rouen when Arthur died. Did he regret supporting John, or did he perhaps share the Pope's view that Arthur, having rebelled against his lord, was guilty of treason? Later, however, Pope Innocent III excommunicated John over his refusal to accept the Pope's choice for Archbishop of Canterbury. As for Arthur's sister, she became the new Duchess of Brittany. What do you think about Arthur's fate? Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.